I want to thank our judges for this year, who include Maria McFarland Sanchez Moreno, James Chappell, Kirsten Weld, and Deborah Jakubs, who is joining us here tonight. This award, which we established over 10 years ago, honors the legacy of Juan Méndez, who is still alive. But he is a great mentor of mine. He's the only human being who's actually hired me for something. And is also just a real hero of human rights for his work with Human Rights Watch, originally America's Watch, and then with the Center for Transitional Justice, and then as a professor, distinguished professor of human rights law at American University, and as the special rapporteur for torture at the UN, among many other things. So we have, luckily, partly because of the work of Patrick Stosky, who's also here, our human rights archivist, Juan's papers here at Duke, which are part of the Human Rights Archive. Guns. Sadly, Americans are accustomed to reading news about guns in our own communities. My daughter is a high school teacher. When she was teaching at Hillside High School, I think she had 6 or 7 lockdowns in only 3 or 4 years as a teacher. This is something that is everyday news for Americans in shopping centers, schools, hospitals, wherever we are. According to the latest available statistics from the CDC, and I underscore available because that has also been gutted, nearly 47,000 people died of gun-related injuries in the most recent year available, which is 2023. This remains exceedingly high. Since 2020, guns have been the leading cause of death among children. That remains the case today. Far from receding, this threat is on the increase. If you read the news today from North Carolina, you will know that the GOP-run legislature just introduced a bill that would, both in the Senate and the House, that would allow most adults to carry a concealed firearm without a permit in the state. This is against the recommendation of law enforcement. I was just at my neighborhood grocery store the other day behind a patron with a gun. This is going to become more and more our everyday reality. But, shocker, this gets worse. And that leads me to what our guest, the winner of the 2025 Méndez Award, will be speaking about today. These days, it's impossible to escape alarm bells about migrants crossing the U.S. border with evil intent and dangerous substances, including fentanyl. Left out of such warnings, of course, are the fact of the tremendous and robust market for these drugs here in the United States. Just as a side note, from my work as a human rights advocate in Colombia, the drugs market in the United States is 3 times as big as it was when I was covering that country for Human Rights Watch. The U.S. war on drugs is probably one of the most failed ever U.S. policies. What's left out of this story, and it is a constructed story, is the subject of this book, Exit Wounds, which is how our gun laws and our tolerance of gun violence is directly harming our neighbor to the south. Just some statistics. 2 out of every 3 murders in Mexico are committed with guns, most illegal. Over 111,000 people in Mexico have been forcibly disappeared, according to the Mexican government, often at the hands of cartels armed with American guns. The issue of femicide, the killings of women, is huge in Mexico. On average, 6 women are murdered with firearms every day in the country. Many of the migrants attempting to leave Mexico and flee into the United States are leaving their homes due to persistent and unrelenting gunfire in their communities. There could not be a timelier issue. Indeed, this issue is currently before the U.S. Supreme Court. Ieva and I were just talking about this, which just held oral arguments on a Mexican claim against the United States, and specifically against U.S. gun manufacturers, who are putting armies worth of guns at the disposal of drug cartels. And Mexico is arguing that the U.S. gun manufacturers have a deliberate and lucrative business strategy to send guns into Mexico. Some estimates put the number of guns annually arriving in Mexico at over 500,000 weapons, and that's yearly. And that is $10 billion. The lawsuit is for $10 billion. The Mexican lawsuit also claims that gun manufacturers are crafting guns that satisfy the quirks of cartel capos. For instance, a gold-plated pistol known as the Super El Jefe, which is Spanish for the big boss. I remember colleagues back in the day when Central America was more in the news for political violence. One of the most well-known paramilitary leaders in El Salvador had a gun in the shape of a penis. And I remember that very clearly. Made an impression. The gun manufacturers argue that they are legally protected and that a lawsuit would undermine gun rights for Americans. So these are very intricately intertwined. Ieva Jusionyte, I got that right. I was practicing in the car. We can also call her Professor Ieva. Wrote this book in part, and this is what I love about this book almost more than anything. It came in part from her own experience as a wildland firefighter and EMT working in Arizona, among other places. If you look at Ieva's professor website, she calls herself, her name, and then PhD, and then after it is EMT, and then P, which is paramedic? EMT paramedic, which is the coolest thing I have seen in a long time. Mad respect for that. An anthropologist. She is the Watson Family University Associate Professor of International Security and Anthropology at Brown University. Exit Wounds follows firearms both as policy, objects, and cultural artifacts. The book is a cultural history of guns in two countries that share the legacies of colonialism and frontier violence. One of our judges, Deborah Jakubs, who's here with us, as a University Librarian Emerita at Duke, and is also a historian of Latin America, wrote that this book, quote, engaged me from the very start. The combination of the author's commitment to the topic, her daring field research, and the personal stories and trajectories of individuals affected by guns, drugs, and violence were captivating. The book connects U.S. gun manufacturing, hunger for drugs, violence in Mexico, and the increasing number of immigrants fleeing that violence, and does so through on-the-ground stories of smugglers, gang members, U.S. agents, and people sucked into the maw of the system, many as they just tried to get by. I'll just say as a last thing, we have some books outside, so please buy a book, and I think Professor Ieva would be kind enough to sign it for you, if that's okay. So please join me in welcoming Ieva to Duke.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Robin, and thank you to all of you for coming. It is really an honor to receive Juan Méndez Award for Exit Wounds, because this award means a lot to me for a few reasons. For one is that Juan Méndez is a role model, and I admire what he has done on behalf of political prisoners. His tireless efforts to stop torture and his dedication to protecting human rights at the UN, at the Human Rights Watch. It also means a lot to me because I have been admiring the authors of books who have been recognized by this award in previous years, and I'm very happy to join the family of these writers and scholars who write about human rights issues in Latin America. And also today, as we are witnessing attacks on human rights in our own country, I believe that what we have seen in Latin America, what we learn from human rights advocates and allies there, can help us find ways to stop erosion of justice in this country and protect human rights in the United States. So thank you again for this recognition of the work done, which I take as an encouragement to do more, to research and write about what hurts in order, hopefully, that this is the first step in healing. So I will start today because Robin already provided such a wonderful overview of my research, and I will go a little bit deeper into that, but I wanted to start by reading from the very first few pages of the book. I follow him downstairs in silence. We step into a room with no windows and just enough space for the two of us to stand without our hands touching. He opens the gun safe and shows me his sacos and beretas, lets me hold one. But we didn't come here for those, and he puts the guns back in the safe and locks it. Floor-to-ceiling shelves are packed with accessories. Vests he wears on hunting trips, several canisters of insect repellent, binoculars. Then rows of screwdrivers, wrenches, pliers. The narrow desk in the center holds a scale and some sort of a metal instrument with a lever. He pulls out a chair, and I sit, my eyes scanning the boxes of cartridges and many things he will name for me: empty casings, primers, oil, smokeless powder, and projectiles. He will teach me what each does, how they all fit together. I ask about a pair of metallic gold markers I notice on the desk in front of me, and he says they are for coloring silver cartridges, to make them look like new. I now understand why I'm here. He stands behind me, points at the materials, and tells me how to do it. Roll the brass shell on a sponge-like pad smeared with a lubricant, place the shell in the press, fit it with a sizing die, clean the primer pocket, trim the brass casing, smooth the inside edge of the shell, then the outside to remove the burr. This step is important, he says. It prevents the bullet getting jammed in the chamber when you load the gun. I work slowly, carefully. It feels like playing with matches. I pour the gunpowder into the brass shell, put the shell back onto the press, seat the bullet on top, and hold it with my left hand as I press the lever with the right to crimp it. I pick it up, my first cartridge, about the size of a chile de árbol rolling in my palm. Then I put it aside and follow the procedure again, this time a little faster. He watches patiently, and when I pause, reminds me what to do. Those who do this regularly can reload about 100 cartridges in one afternoon. It takes me what seemed like an hour to make 4. Later, I will learn that .308 Winchester is the ammunition of choice for military and police sniper rifles. It is the civilian version of the 7.62 51mm NATO round that American soldiers fed their M14s in Vietnam, that the Mexican army still used at the turn of this century to load their G3s. Longer and more powerful than the same diameter cartridge used by AK-47s, it can hit a human-sized target half a mile away, and SWAT snipers rely on its accuracy to penetrate the skulls of hostage takers. But the ones I made are not meant for people. They will most likely kill deer or antelope, maybe an elk, possibly a boar. Each weighs just 24 grams, like 5 sheets of copy paper. When I stand up to leave, I don't take them with me. They are material evidence that could implicate him, implicate me. By now, I am used to this, not keeping anything, not taking pictures, not taking down people's names. When I write about them, I call them by names I invented for them when I scribbled their number or directions to find them in my notebook. Those are the only names I remember. Some people, though, don't even get fake names, but I can assure you that they too exist. There is a principle in storytelling that suggests that noticeable details should be integrated into the plot. It is known as Chekhov's gun. The Russian author advised young playwrights that if a gun appeared in the first act, it should be fired by the third. But that's not how it works in Mexico. The way borderland journalist Charles Bowden put it, in Mexico, the gun may never appear, can be fired at any moment, and the body will fall to the floor with no explanation. Your life will have a narrative arc, and in the third act, you will be killed. But no one will hear the gun go off, and no one will know why you died. And more often, no one will know who you are. Before I saw the guns, I saw the wounds. The young man sat on the bench in front of me, and after looking around to make sure nobody else was listening, leaned closer. His voice, barely louder than a whisper, blended in with the hum of a large industrial fan, pushing hot desert air around the building with makeshift walls and corrugated metal roof. He said his name was Raul, that he was from Acapulco, the resort city on Guerrero's Pacific coast. He fled after men wearing balaclavas forced his father into a truck and then dumped his decapitated body onto the street. I met Raul and many others, men, women, children, Mexican, Salvadoran, Honduran, at the AIDS Center for Migrants steps away from the U.S. border in Nogales, Sonora, where I was providing medical aid as a volunteer. They came with blisters on their feet, infected wounds, fever, trying to outpace fear and not lose hope along the way. That was 8 years ago, before President Trump ordered miles of new walls to be built, before the COVID-19 pandemic and Title 42, before I cared to know the difference between 9mm and 7.62. When in the summer of 2022 I returned to Nogales, the medical clinic had moved to a separate room with the floor-to-ceiling cabinets full of supplies at the new spacious migrant center across the street from the old one. Alejandra was sitting on the chair by the closed door while I poured red gooey Tylenol syrup into plastic cups and handed them to each of her 3 small children. Threats started coming, she said, sharing tiny pieces of her story. This family, like Raul years earlier, had come from Guerrero, and so did many others I spoke to that day. They were farmers and taxi drivers, cooks and craftsmen who had fled their home when they could no longer pay extortion fees, when gunmen came to take away their cattle, burn their mango orchards, when the neighbors and relatives were killed or disappeared. There is no law, Alejandra said. There was nowhere they could turn to for protection. Some had tried, went to the police, only to start receiving threats from them too. So they packed what they could carry and headed toward the US border. Not everyone talked about the reasons they were fleeing Mexico. At the clinic, we didn't ask them to say more about themselves than what they wanted, focusing instead on what little we could do for them. But they didn't even have to say anything. Their bodies, exhausted, dehydrated, marked by scars, were evidence that something back home had gone seriously awry for them to risk their lives on the journey north. So I first moved to the U.S. Mexico border, to southern Arizona and northern Sonora in 2015. I was both doing research and as an anthropologist, studying how the militarization of the border, the building of the wall, was affecting the life of migrants, but also of residents in these binational communities that depend on cross-border ties. And I was also there as an EMT paramedic and wildland firefighter volunteering on both sides of the border. And I met many people whose stories were some versions of Raul's and Alejandra's. Mexicans remain the largest national group of people who try to cross the US-Mexico border. Last year alone, it was over 650,000 Mexicans who were apprehended by the Border Patrol. This is not a very accurate number. These are only people that encounter the Border Patrol, and most Mexicans do not present themselves at ports of entry to ask for asylum because the kinds of violence they are fleeing, they are not included in the mid-20th century convention still governing international humanitarian law that allow them to seek asylum. So for Mexico, about 4% of all people who apply for asylum are granted it. So living in Nogales, I routinely cross the border back and forth, sometimes every day. And with all things that we take for granted, it was a while before I began noticing these big signs that say either on southbound roads or if you cross through the port of entry, it say guns and ammunition illegal, penalty prison. And it was these signs, these warnings that alerted me to something that I couldn't see and didn't know about, what scholars and journalists have called the Iron River of guns flowing south. So Mexico has very strict gun laws. The Ley Federal de Armas, the federal firearms law, which they passed in 1971, during a period of widespread student organizing and anti-government protest, a period when there was a lot of armed resistance by guerrilla groups, both urban and rural, and also intensifying repression by the government during what's called as Mexico's dirty war. So the law itself, the firearms law, was proposed by President Luis Echeverria only, I think, months after he ordered the brutal suppression of student demonstrations on Corpus Christi Day, known as the Corpus Christi Massacre. And it was primarily because the government was fearing social unrest. So they created the law to uphold states' monopoly of force through the control of the tools of violence, the guns. It's interesting to remember that this is only a few years after the US passed the Gun Control Act of 1968, which was also came to be because in response to political violence in the United States. So what that law did, it implemented age restrictions for buying firearms, required all guns to have serial numbers, and it established licensing requirements for firearms dealers. But other than that, it's considerably less strict than Mexican law. So the Mexican law outlines in minute detail what firearms, which civilians, and under what conditions can meet. And most people can only legally own one handgun of a small caliber for self-defense, for protection, kept at home. People who are hunters or recreational shooters, they can apply to get a permit for shotguns or rifles of small calibers, but they have to be members of gun clubs. And they have to renew their licenses very, very often and register the guns every year. Large calibers, such as most, 7.62 used by AK-47s or 223s used by AR-15s and 5.56 used by AR-15s, they are restricted for the use of the Army, Navy, and the National Guard in Mexico. And there is only one, so the SEDENA, the Secretariat of National Defense, is the only institution that can import guns into Mexico and sell them. Since the 1970s, there was only one gun store. Now there are 2 gun stores in Mexico where people can go and buy guns if they pass all the requirements. So the number of gun stores that exist in Mexico today, there are 2, both of them on military bases. If we count the number of licensed gun dealerships only in the US states bordering Mexico, from California to Texas, there are almost 10,000. And this doesn't include gun shows, it doesn't include private gun sales like arranged through Facebook or other ways. So we know that the US has this unlimited supply of guns, more guns than people, in fact. But why is there such a demand for guns in Mexico? So I think Robin also hinted to the question, to the issue of drugs. In the US, the twin problems of prohibition of recreational drugs, primarily marijuana and cocaine, and an addiction epidemic to heroin, other kinds of opioids, meth, has created the demand for these substances, which, at least since the 1980s, has been primarily satisfied by organized crime groups, by smugglers from Mexico. And these groups were competing for resources and for trafficking routes, and to get the guns that they couldn't obtain in Mexico, they turned to the United States. Sometimes exchanging drugs for guns, other times using drug proceeds to buy guns, assembling arsenals that by now rival and are actually bigger than local police forces and some of the federal forces. And once they became armed, these organized crime groups expanded their domain beyond drug trafficking to other lucrative and sometimes easier activities, such as smuggling migrants, kidnapping people for ransom, recruiting youth into their forces, and most extensively threatening business owners and farmers and everyone they could through extortion rackets. So the numbers are not reliable, very reliable when we talk about any illicit activity, but they can point out trends. So more then 70%, that's 70, of all firearms recovered in crime scenes in Mexico are originally sold in the United States. Texas and Arizona alone, these two states account for 60% of all crime guns recovered in Mexico. But guns that are found in Mexico come from every single state in the United States, including Hawaii and even Guam. North Carolina, I checked before coming, was the source of 390 firearms recovered in Mexico between 2015 and 2022, which is the last period for which we have accurate data, as well as 34 guns that were found during that period in Honduras and 10 in Guatemala and El Salvador each. It's not much compared to Texas, but it's not nothing. And it is estimated that anywhere between 200,000, maybe 500,000, maybe more guns cross the border annually. Most popular are pistols, like 9mm pistols. Not everyone can get the El Jefe models of Colt. These are for leaders more often, but also the assault-style rifles. So AK-47s and AR-15s are especially popular. Also, in Mexico, in recent years, has been recovering more of these 50 caliber Barrett rifles. So 50 caliber Barrett rifle is, the cartridge of that rifle is like a Sharpie marker. And they are accurate at distances longer than 10 football fields, can penetrate walls and shoot down helicopters. Guns that are really have no value, well, no use on the civilian market, but in the United States, in many states, you can go and buy as many as you can afford because one costs about $10,000. So meanwhile, how many guns do you think are seized on the border, either by U.S. Customs or by the Mexican Customs? Because guns get into Mexico the same way that drugs get into the United States, through ports of entry, mostly hidden in vehicles, and in car panels, in gas tanks. And one car can transport like a couple of rifles in the door panels, and like 40 or more in auxiliary gas tank. So the customs seizes, in 2019, U.S. Customs seized 189 guns. And the Mexican Customs seized 122 more. These numbers have increased a little bit during the pandemic because the agents didn't have much to do checking people coming into the US. The border was closed, so they were stationed on outbound lanes, and they checked more cars and found more guns. But not much more, or maybe like a few hundred. So it is this vicious circle of violence, this loop of insecurity, which means that more guns make more people flee to seek safety on this side of the border. So to understand this, the role, the complicity of the United States in producing this violence that has made so many Mexicans refugees from their country, that has displaced the people I met at the Migrant Aid Center, I decided to follow the guns south, as commodities, as things that move across the US-Mexico border, as well as across the boundary between the legal and the illegal. And as a paramedic, I knew what guns do to human bodies and how bleeding they caused could be too much for us to save an injured person before we took them to the hospital. But the effects of guns in general, and of US guns in Mexico in particular, are not just physical. They are also social and economic and political. So that is what I'm talking when I'm talking about exit wounds. And although it varies from state to state, in recent years, the majority of Mexicans said they felt insecure in the places where they live. Nationwide, it is about 2/3. Many crimes are not reported out of fear and distrust of local law enforcement. Human Rights Watch published a report exactly 1 month ago in which they noted that of all the homicide cases that are open in Mexico, only fewer than 10% nationwide result in a verdict, guilty or not guilty, but most of those who result in the guilty verdict involve the torture of suspects or alteration of evidence. So these are the exit wounds. Also, there are disappearances that Robin also mentioned. As of today, more than 116 people have been officially registered as forcibly disappeared. And this is how gun violence affects, how guns tear the social fabric, and the collective damage they cause that is shared by families, by neighborhoods, by communities, and that extend from present to future generations. So Exit Wounds draws on a variety of methods and sources, including thousands of pages of court transcripts, and other court records, but it is first and foremost a multi-sided ethnography. So following the guns for me meant hanging out with people who buy them and sell them, who live with them, who use them, people whose life and works entails crisscrossing the border and the law. So I can tell you about a couple of these people. For example, Ricky. Ricky was born in Nogales, Sonora, on the Mexican side. He was very good at baseball when he was in high school. He attended high school in southern Arizona, so he was crossing the border every day to attend school. He was so good that he was recruited by the Seattle Mariners as a professional baseball player. But he got a shoulder injury, and the Mariners didn't renew his contract. He returned to Nogales. He started hanging out with his old friends and family, and one day somebody in Mexico suggested he can make really good money if he smuggled things from the United States. Those things meant ammunition, so he had to drive all the way from Nogales, bypassing Tucson to Phoenix, which is at least 3 hours from Nogales, and pack these duffel bags with ammunition, tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, and take them to Mexico. When he was caught one day, he was indicted as part of a case that had over 20 people, many of them members of the same family, including a wife, a sister, a cousin, mother who participated in this. And a lot of gun smugglers are, or people who have the straw purchases who buy the guns are U.S. citizens, or at least permanent residents, because they are the only ones who can buy guns legally in gun stores. Sales of ammunition are much less regulated. Then there is another, my friend Miguel, about whom I also write in the book. He's a very different type of person whose life is affected by U.S. firearms. So he's a businessman. He owns a construction company in Monterrey, Mexico's third largest city, I think, by now. He likes hunting. He likes collecting guns. He has a gun permit and has way more guns than that permit allows him to have. He smuggles them from the United States because he can get better types of guns for hunting, but also for self-protection. So some of his friends, he had a friend who was kidnapped for ransom, and Miguel was one of those people who said, I'll take my security into my own hands. I don't trust the police. I'll carry the gun, although it's illegal. I'll get away with it. He has gotten away with it. And then there is Samara. So Samara is one of the main protagonists of this book, and she's a young woman I met also in Monterrey, whose life connects many of the threads in the story. So migration to the United States, insecurity in Mexico, recruitment of foot soldiers into organized crime groups, their training at these training and extermination camps. If you've been following the news now in Mexico about the Teuchitlan in Jalisco, camps like that. And when she was barely a teenager, she was she was abducted and forcefully recruited and trained in such a camp to work with the Zetas. And then she rose through the ranks, becoming a leader of a small cell, tasked with paying off the police and sometimes kidnapping them. So I will read a little bit from the part of the book which tells Samara's story. The first time Samara saw them, on an otherwise unremarkable day in 2009, she was taking out the trash. Heavily armed, they were sitting in a car in front of the 4-story apartment building she'd been living in. As soon as she noticed them, she wanted to run, but fear shackled her feet. Then she realized they were not all strangers. Some were friends of her cousins. She'd seen them hang out together. Reluctantly, she greeted them. "What's your name?" asked one of the guys. He wore thick-rimmed glasses and a yellow Tigres jersey. She knew he worked for the Zetas. She already knew about the Zetas. The last letter of the alphabet had been excised from the local lexicon as if refusal to identify the group denied its existence. But the menace spread, enveloping the city like a fog, making it hard to see the shape of things. All residents could do was listen to rumors, to threats, to the staccato of gunfire jolting them at night. For years shielded from violence devastating other parts of Mexico, Regiomontanos, as the people of Monterrey called themselves, found that war was at their doorstep. Samara, she said, how old are you? 16. And your parents? They're upstairs. It was a lie. 2 lies, actually. Samara was 13 and lived alone. Her parents separated soon after she was born when her father left for Houston and her mother for Fort Worth. They stayed in Texas, formed new families. Samara grew up with her maternal grandmother, who worked long hours, and her teenage aunts who bullied her. Once a week, she'd escape to her father's parents, her abuelitos, to the house with a bakery. That was the way things were when she was little and had no say. Now she was independent, trying to make it on her own. Orale, the young man said, without showing whether he believed her. Would you like to get inside? No, she replied firmly, then turned around and he headed back up. Her apartment afforded a decent view of the neighborhood, an urban mass of bricks and concrete sliced up into rectangles and sutured by a cobweb of cables, with a few specks of green here and there. The little money residents could spend on exterior design went into iron fences and window grates. Even by these standards, Samara's home was austere. It was a big apartment, pretty, but it had nothing, she said. There was no stove to cook, no fridge to store food. Samara slept on an air mattress, the single piece of furniture inside. But she didn't complain. Those weeks after she first ran into the armed guys in the car, she was mostly staying home, nothing to lay her eyes on but the action outside. She stood by the window at the same hour day after day and watched the same group return. She avoided them, planning her trips outside only when they were not around. But one day, on her way back from her grandparents' house, she took a different route, which made her walk past a store that served as a meeting point for members of organized crime. Groups of armed men, including the ones she saw coming to the lot in front of her apartment building, would pull up in their trucks and settle their deals there. Samara tried passing them unnoticed, but she heard someone whistle at her and stopped. How dare you, she confronted the guy. At the moment, she didn't see that he had a gun. Shut up, you don't know who he is, someone there tried to warn her. Me vale madre, she said, feeling righteous. That's when it all started, she told me later. She remembered a burst of laughter, then the guy with the gun giving an order, pick her up. Several men grabbed her and shoved her into a truck. Blindfolded, she could not see where they were taking her. The truck made a few stops before someone opened the door and pulled her out. She found herself in a room with other captives. Some of them were members of rival gangs, others were people kidnapped for ransom. Samara lost track of time, of how many days, how many nights she was there. They moved her from place to place with the other captives. Dead bodies they left behind reminded the ones still alive what would happen to those who were overpriced in this economy of violence, those whose families could not afford to save them. At some point, the guys asked Samara about her parents, and she said she did not have a family. My parents are dead, she said. She told them her truth. I'm on my own. Perhaps they believed her because they let her go. Then, a couple of days later, she heard a knock on the door. Comandante is waiting for you, the messenger said, and took her to meet the bespectacled young man she talked to that day outside her apartment building. She would learn to call him Comandante Gafudo. Comandante gave her a 9mm. Do you like it, he asked. No, she said. Pues, you will. So, also, as Robin already mentioned, in August 2021, the Mexican government sued U.S. gun manufacturers at the federal court in Massachusetts for their contribution to epidemic of gun violence in Mexico. U.S.-based companies, including Smith & Wesson, Colt, Barrett, Century Arms, which is making the AK-47s and importing them too, have been supplying most of the firearms recovered in crime scenes in Mexico, and as the lawsuit argued, have inflicted massive injury to the Mexican people and the Mexican government, which has been struggling with the mounting cost of medical care and mental health services, incurred significant expenses for police, courts, and prisons, and endured extensive economic losses. So the lawsuit even called the guns the venom in the snakes that are the drug cartels. But there is a law in the United States, a law known as PLACA, Protection of Legal Commerce in Arms Act, which was passed in 2005 by Congress with 2/3 majority, which protects U.S. gun companies from civil liability for damages that their products cause to people in the United States. Mexico's lawyers argued that their country never made such a social contract with U.S. gun makers to exempt them from liability for damages. Mexican government also filed another lawsuit against several gun dealerships in Arizona that have been engaging in these negligent practices. A lot of their guns were recovered in Mexico. But now the lawsuits are on hold until the Supreme Court decides, which should happen sometime probably in May or June. And we'll see whether the gun manufacturers have the same level of legal immunity for violence abroad as they do in the United States. The current administration, like its predecessors, sees the U.S. border as a source of threats. U.S.-Mexico border sees as a source of threats for the United States. Illicit drugs, unauthorized migrants, an invasion, and what is still, although now there is more talk about it, but it is still largely ignored that this obsession with the perpetual crisis on the border is related to our obsession with guns. So firearms made, imported, and sold in the United States that create the conditions for criminal violence in Mexico, but also in Central America, in the Caribbean, in Haiti. Over 80% of guns come from the United States, most of them from Florida via sea route, so a little different, but the same. So during the first phone call in early February, President Claudia Sheinbaum and President Donald Trump, they talked about what can each country do for the other. And President Trump asked Mexico to stop migrants and stop fentanyl and other drugs. And President Sheinbaum asked Trump to stop guns, gun trafficking. And while Mexico has increased enforcement in the past few months, even before that, they have been doing that, and they increased the seizure of drugs. Unfortunately, U.S. is not very likely to keep our end of the bargain because the kind of policy changes that would be needed to stop gun trafficking are not the ones that U.S. gun lobby would be very excited about. And therefore, these are not very likely to happen. But perhaps I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong. So I probably am running out of time. I can read one more paragraph, and then if we have questions. During the time it took me to write this book, US factories made tens of millions of firearms. In 2020 alone, despite economic shutdowns due to the pandemic, US gun manufacturers produced over 6 million handguns and nearly 3 million rifles, more than in years past. In 2021, production ramped up even further to nearly 8 million handguns and almost 4 million rifles. If researchers are right, about 250,000 of those US-made weapons, and more if we add guns that US companies imported from Europe and Asia, ended up in Mexico. It means that since I started following the guns south in 2018, over 1 million firearms may have been smuggled across the border. In the same period, more than 100,000 Mexican citizens died from gunshot wounds. Over 1 million tried to flee their country. Hundreds got injured during their attempts to cross into the United States. At least 2,372 died trying. Any questions?
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. My question is about how you were accepted by the people whose trust you had to build to develop this book and get the information that you have assembled. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a key question. I touched on it briefly in the appendix or end of the book. So when I began this project, I didn't know that anyone would ever agree to speak with me. I'm an ethnographer. I need to speak to people who traffic guns. And I thought, okay, well, if nobody does that, maybe I can write something like a social history of a commodity, like Sidney Mintz did with sugar or Annette Singh with mushrooms. But the amazing thing is that people wanted to talk about it. So in Mexico, I was very open. I said, I want to know what are American guns doing in Mexico? Do you know anyone who has a smuggled gun and things like that? And at first, I got to know people who were gun enthusiasts, so like Miguel. But after a while, I started talking to members of gangs and organized crime groups. And I think the luxury that anthropologist or ethnographer like me has is time. So I was not there for 1 week or 1 month. I was there for a long time. And if someone, or the people who first were the brave ones, because there are always people who want to share their stories and they can't talk to their families about these things, they can't talk publicly about these things, and why not talk to this researcher? So some of those who shared and nothing happened to them, then their friends were a little braver next year to talk to me. But the most important thing, or two very important things. One, a lot of people didn't trust me and never talked to me. So really, I was surprised by how many of them volunteered to share the information and their stories, but I was not surprised at all by how many said, no way. And even people who shared their stories and trusted me, that trust was always tentative on both sides. So one, I couldn't trust them entirely because some of them, like Samara, they kidnapped people for ransom for a living. And I had to go and meet with them alone. And they could not trust me entirely, because although I said I am an anthropologist writing a book, I could have as well been FBI or CIA or who knows what. So that tentative trust was the only precondition for writing this book, but also, I would say, a limitation. Reading this book now, I think I could have done more. I could have gone further, but I respected the boundaries of where I felt that I'm too afraid to go to that meeting in the neighborhood where I don't know whether an Uber will come and pick me up at night. So, yeah.
Next. Oh, okay, sorry. I wasn't sure there was a whole system going on. I didn't want to mess it up. First of all, thank you. Really powerful talk, and I'm eager to read the book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I'm anxious to now. I was thinking about teaching it and thought it would give a whole new meaning to trigger warnings, because this sounds kind of scary. I did have a question about how you felt about your personal safety, and then two questions, maybe one of which might be better answered by the committee. But one is the first is about how your research makes us reconceptualize how we understand human rights itself as something, because it's clearly a sovereignty problem, right? That the United States is not respecting Mexican law, not for the first time. But how we think about the relationship between private corporations and human rights and somebody's rights are being violated for sure, and you can't go anywhere in Mexico now without people talking about the fear of violence. I mean, even in Mexico City, which I think is relatively safe, the middle of Condesa, people are worried about, but I don't know, but it's a different concept of human rights than I think certainly from mid-20th century, but even I think more recently than we've thought of. And so I'm curious about that, either from you or the committee, who obviously see what you're doing as a question of human rights. And the second question is maybe more appropriate to you as an ethnographer, which is, we think about the problem of guns in the United States being because we have a gun culture, and like that or that something about our like deep history of, frontier mythology or something, name your whatever. And I'm curious how you saw that translate, or what's happening, or maybe that's just a kind of nonsense explanation that we should let go of, or, just sort of where the cultural part of it fits in here. Thank you.
Well, both, there was a third question about safety too, so like three, three really extensive questions. The one about gun culture is something I asked myself when I did this research very much, so how come these two different countries that are neighbors, that were both colonized by Europeans, that became independent, they developed such different gun cultures? And there is the two-pronged answer. One is there is a gun culture in Mexico. It's just not, guns are not associated with individual rights and liberties the same way as it is in the United States. Mexico doesn't have a powerful gun lobby. That explains a lot of things in terms of gun laws. But there are people who read Safari International and like hunting and like gun collecting. It's just not, and the Constitution allows gun ownership, although also restricts it, but it is part of, it's not part of their national identity, like it has become, unfortunately, in the United States. Through marketing, companies that engage in marketing did a lot to create this gun culture in the US. In terms of human rights, yeah, I would like to hear from the committee as well, but the way I think about it is, well, right to life is, I think, the most essential of all rights, but this extends further. So US-made weapons and just violence in general in Mexico, last year Mexico held elections. Over 30 candidates at various levels were killed. So what about political rights? What about social rights? I think that's kind of a broad question. And in terms of safety, I was briefly a journalist before I was an anthropologist, and I sometimes work and collaborate with journalists, and they have been extremely helpful, sharing kind of various safety protocols. We checked in on each other. But the most important thing was I respected my own boundaries, what I didn't trust doing. The university global security office also gave me a satellite radio and said, we could be there in 24 hours after you press this button. Yeah, 24 hours. I ditched the radio because it was more of a liability to carry that around than not carry it around. I also, I trained in self-defense. I trained in Krav Maga for years. I thought anything I can do, even teeny tiny thing, I'll do. But in the end, it's, yeah, maybe I'm here because I was a little bit of a coward.
Wow, glad you're here.
Thank you. When you finished your reading, I wanted to applaud, but it didn't feel like but I didn't want to applaud. So I feel like I just want to acknowledge that I think what you've written is beautiful, but in a horrific way. And so I want to thank you so much for sharing this. I'm thinking about, this room is filled with students, not just us olds. And so this is not your first or your second. Also, I cannot believe you write so quickly about such intense issues at borders. So I want to acknowledge that. And I think one of the questions I would love to hear you think about or talk about is your writing practice or your research practice, particularly because there are undergraduates and graduate students in the room, and this is not your first, and it's not your second book, right? So it's just to say, like, this is not like, for Like, so I want to ask you to maybe reflect a little bit about the writing experience, and sort of the research trajectory that brings you to get to exit wounds. And then, so that's one question. The second question, I have other things I'm going to talk about at dinner, but the second question that I would think would be really fun to hear you talk about, and I just want to acknowledge in this room, is that I think you are an amazing example of a public scholar. And I so deeply respect not just the courage for you to do the research that you're doing, but also you are on like television with this book, because I follow her on Facebook and she's amazing. And so I just want to thank you so much for that. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the research process that gets you to this book and your writing process from graduate student to now, tenured and safe. And then the sort of your thoughts on the public scholarship side of this book. So thank you so much.
I also feel like, as you say, you didn't want to applaud. Whenever I talk about this book, often I'm so happy to be with people and I want to smile, but I also feel so horrible smiling when I do this. So yeah, I appreciate the rainy weather today because the dissonance is a little less severe than on sunny days to talk about this grim subject. Writing, well, in terms of the research, how I got to this is I always, and I think this is a good lesson for the students, when I did my dissertation research, I think I didn't yet know what I wanted to do. I kind of created a project. But since then, I always fall into the next one because of something that happens or I notice, right? So after my dissertation research, I thought I don't want to be in academia. I want to be a firefighter, paramedic, EMT. I did all that. And then one day I read an article in New York Times about emergency responders on the border and how fire departments are overburdened by migrant injuries. And I thought, oh, I am a paramedic. Like I'm also interested in border issues. I could do that. And when I did that research, that's where I noticed the guns, and then I followed the guns, and that kind of continues. I like writing. It's not that I like. This is wonderful. I like having written, maybe similar to it like gives meaning to my days. Like when I go run in the morning, I feel that way. And when I write, I used to like spend, mornings are, I'm a morning person. So mornings for me was writing. I would sit down and just write until lunch. I would schedule my classes in the afternoon if I can. I do write these writing bursts where I would go like somewhere in a cabin in the woods and write all week nonstop, morning till evening. It was also, writing allows me to understand what I'm thinking about the subject. So I need to write and have many drafts, and it's okay if in the beginning I have no idea what I'm talking about. I will find out as I'm writing. Storytelling is a little different, so describing these, telling the stories of these people, but especially like if I want to make an argument, I need to write it out. And it also, writing this book in particular was especially both difficult and helpful. So it was difficult because I was writing a book about gun violence. How do you write a book that, people go into the bookstore and think, oh, I need something to read this weekend. Why don't I pick this book about gun violence? So not just people who are assigned this book and have to read in classroom, but actually wanted it to read. So I read a lot, and I was kind of thinking about how do nonfiction writers, how do thriller writers, how do fiction writers use these narrative techniques to make the story engaging. So the book it's comprised of these, it's like braided narrative. You follow certain characters throughout the book, and then there are more like background chapters. So I tried to write this way to make it palatable. And writing was difficult, but it was good for me because when I came back from doing this field work, I was in shock in many ways. and putting this into writing helped me process some of the things. I didn't have a therapist, so writing the book was my form of therapy. Yeah. Oh, the public, yes, the public. So the public stuff, I mean, if you go on like CNN show with Fareed Zakaria, they air 4 minutes and it takes like 2 days. They do a pre-interview for you, and then you have to know how to condense like research you spent years doing that's really nuanced and complex into like sound bites. So all they have time is like 2-sentence answers. Like how do you do that? So I'm frustrated by it, but at the same time I feel like I owe it to, well, both to my previous project, but also to people in this project to go and speak. It's not easy not only doing it, but it's hard the part that comes after. So the hate mail, I am surprised by how, you know, people listen to an NPR show and then they think, I will look this person up, I will find her email, and I will write this nasty misogynistic message. Wow. Real dedication, right? So yeah, it comes with that too. And I know it can hurt people, and yeah.
Thank you so much for speaking. This has been really awesome. I kind of have a question about like what your research means for advocates in this space and like how this translates to policy change and like making all of this better. Because I think obviously gun violence prevention is like pretty robust in the United States, and there are a lot of different people and a lot of different groups doing this work, but I haven't really seen any of this work cross borders before. Like I've done some of this work before, and all of it is very focused internally on the US, on schools, on communities, on inner city violence, all of that. And so I'm curious how you feel like all of this translates and like what advocates can learn from your work in translating this cross-border problem into advocacy and policy change.
There are, especially since the lawsuit, but there are groups who are trying. So Every Town for Gun Safety, for example, is part of this. There are some of these networks where U.S. gun safety advocates are working with collectives of families of the disappeared, for example, in Mexico. It's still in kind of let's meet and talk about it on a monthly basis situation. Maybe let's write a letter to the president and outline something. But that sort of has started. The end of the book also has some kind of concrete policy solutions that would amplify the message of gun rights advocates, gun safety advocates in the United States. Especially things like anything that would make guns safer in the United States would help with violence in Mexico. Anything. If we had safer storage, if we had background checks on private sales, if we had, for example, smart guns, to open my phone, I need to scan my face or a thumb. Like, we could do that on guns, and then they would not be appealing to traffickers. And there is technology, and it still preserves your right to own those guns. So there are all these solutions sort of that could help. Yeah. But the problem is that if violence in the United States, if shootings of kids in schools has so little impact on our gun policies, like violence in Mexico matters so much less. But I think we need a political solution, and we need to build a movement, and all those advocates on all sides of the border should be part of it. I was in Mexico City just last month, and there was not only groups from the United States and Mexico and Central America, as well as Haiti and other Caribbean countries. So slow change.
I really love this book and Threshold as well. And one question that I had, I'm a grad student, haven't started ethnography, but one thing I was wondering about, I guess especially with Threshold, is how you manage, or what do you do about those relationships that are, so, I mean, you're part of that team there, and I imagine the camaraderie. Like, what do you do afterwards with the, so that one felt very much like, oh, wow, I can't imagine, how do you move on after this? And then with this book, like you were talking about informants or conversation partners on the other side, but like also law enforcement on this side that you talk with, and do they keep up with your work? Are they wondering about what the relationship meant? Does that make sense? Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense, and I really appreciate those questions. Yeah, ethnography is, it's human relationship, right? So when I finished this project, I thought I can never do ethnography again, just because of how, well, I quoted her in my book, but now I don't know whether I should anymore, but Alice Munro talked about the pain of human contact. So I remained a very good, in touch with emergency responders on the border. Some of them are like family to me. Some of them retired already. I go visit them once in a while. I still talk about that book. It's hard to move on. That's true. It has been very different for this book, though, because the kind of people I was working with were not the ones that I trusted with my life, or those relationships were not as strong. And still, like even today, this afternoon, I got a message from Signal, from like a retired agent who is a friend of another agent that I wrote about. So one of the agents I write about in this book invited me to his retirement party like this spring. So they all bought the book and they all read it and they all appreciated the representation. For me, ethnography is, you don't maintain the same, and you don't even have, while you're doing ethnography, the same intensity of relationships with absolutely everyone. But there are people who become more than participants in your project. And those people stay in your life, and you send them Uber Eats to somewhere in Mexico when they don't get their salary, or you never ever traffic guns for them. Yeah, it's hard, but that's the beauty of ethnography.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was really struck by the fact that you're interested in the cultural dimension of all of this, and I actually wanted to ask you because I'm sorry I haven't read the book yet, but to invite you also to reflect on gender dynamics, especially, right, at least coming from the U.S. side. I think it's more of like a primarily masculine culture, so I'm curious what you think, especially when we think about Mexican gun culture.
Yes, gender. It's always the question I get because it's never the central one in my book. So if we think that U.S. gun culture is masculine, Mexico's is like double that. But the U.S. gun culture is not so entirely, like you can go now, there are, pink AR-15s, and there are bachelorette parties and gun clubs. And if you look at the people who have bought guns more recently, especially like handguns since the pandemic, a lot more women and people of color are buying guns. So that culture is sort of shifting despite the narratives that we have, of the frontier and kind of masculine style of freedom. In Mexico, women are primarily the victims of violence, again, as Robin also mentioned. And that was one of the reasons why Samara is one of the main protagonists in my book, because I was so surprised when I found her and she wanted to talk, because most of the other people in this project, whether they were US law enforcement, whether they were hunters, or gun collectors, whether they were gang members or members of organized crime, almost all of them were male. And yes, I don't know how to answer the question, how the dynamic that I was a female researcher in the field changed that, because I don't know how it would have been otherwise. Yeah.
So the question I'm sort of trying to formulate in my mind is, after reading the book, the gun imagined in the Ley de Armas from the 1970s is so far away from the gun as imagined by the people who are using it in the ethnography. So it seems like sort of a typology of the way that people engage with guns is as a tool for a criminal economy, as a beleaguered police force, as a consumer object, almost like a fetishistic object of desire for personal enjoyment. But a gun as a utopian object, as something that could achieve national liberation or some sort of revolutionary movement or a communitarian self-defense, a la the Black Panthers, is so far away from the way that guns are operating now. So I was curious if that's an accurate analysis of the way sort of like the figure of the gun, what the gun is imagined to be achievable, or to potentially achieve. And if there's ever, when people are talking about it, there's ever like, wow, to be Pancho Villa, and to imagine that the gun, or to be the, what is it, the Angolan flag, the Mozambique flag that has the AK-47 on it. Is there that yearning that people express, or are we past the possible imagination of the revolutionary gun?
Wow. No, I don't think we're past that, but I think we primarily did do that when we project our fantasies onto the past. So yes, in Mexico, if you think about the revolution, there are all these, whether it's Pancho Villa or, well, even if you go and look at the muralists, you would see them, like all the leaders of the revolution wearing bandoliers, and the guns are so prominent for Mexican nationhood. And those guns were mostly foreign, so they were procured at great expense from the United States. Mexico didn't have a firearm industry, and that, like Venustiano Carranza, who was the leader of the post-revolutionary Mexico, he very clearly said, Mexico has to create its own firearms so they don't depend on the abroad. It's I don't know whether you can say that it's kind of diminishing these days. When the Zapatista revolution happened, the big deal was that they were not armed, right? Yeah, I think in terms of what I saw talking to people about guns in Mexico, they see it way much more pragmatically. And although there is this museum and there is this gun culture, you put these like gold plates on your guns and diamonds and your names and all of that to kind of make it a luxury object. That's very, very rare. Most people who are at the bottom ranks of the organized crime, they don't do such things, and neither do most hunters do such things. Guns are much more utilitarian. Either it is to threaten other people or to kill animals or whatnot, but they are not. People talk about, oh, my grandfather participated in the revolution and this gun came down from that, but it's not kind of so symbolically potent as it could possibly be.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if there's time, I'll jump in.
This will be our last question.
Too much pressure. Well, first of all, Ieva, I just share all of Christine's praise for you, and especially in your profile as a public intellectual. I also have been a groupie for a while, although I think it was mainly on Twitter, and then I ran screaming with Elon, so it's been a while, but it's so amazing to have you here. So question one is whether you have any tools or thoughts for us to sort of think differently about the relationship between the way these guns get into Mexico through sort of, private enterprise, but that's sort of enabled, I guess, by U.S. policy and protections of the gun industry, versus like the very explicit history of as like state policy, us arming, people, whether it's historically like, the Contras in Nicaragua or currently arming Israel as it commits genocide. So, guns that sort of filter out through, all of these local level exchanges versus like, I guess arming as a program as a wing of foreign policy, right? And then my second question is just an invitation. You said this beautiful thing that I had also noticed in your two books about like how you're following a story. And so the one book leads directly into the other, and then you kind of trailed off. And so I wanted to sort of like invite you, if you felt ready and comfortable, to tell us like what you said. I noticed things like at the end of a project that start making the next project come together. So I thought, I might not be the only person in the room who'd love to hear what you're thinking about now.
So for the first question, actually, some Mexican military and police do import guns from the United States. Like when the Monterrey created this Fuerza Civil, a very specialized police forces, they were all armed with American guns. And some of those guns are sold, and get on the black market from the Mexican military. Also, some of the guns that are circulating in Mexico come from Central America, like leftovers from the civil wars or U.S. arming the Honduran government and things like that. So yes, the majority come through this free market, private company route, but some of them are diverted from the governments. In terms of the second question, I am already knee-deep into my next research. And so when I was writing the conclusion to the book, I wanted to see, so where did the leaders of these organized crime groups, primarily Gulf Cartel and the Zetas, because this book is primarily in the Northeast Mexico, so what happened to them? So either they are dead, or they were extradited to the US, and they are in prisons in the US. Now, then I had a question. So if these leaders, like Zetas, you can say El Chapo, because everyone knows El Chapo, are extradited to the US, they are charged with drug trafficking, they might get a life sentence, or they might cooperate with the US government in exchange for, maybe testified against others, and then they get into witness protection and live happily ever after. What happens in Mexico, where the homicides, the kidnappings, the extortions, they're never investigated? These people are extradited to the US midway through investigation. So yes, some people say, at least they are not, cheating the justice system and are in prisons to the United States. Some are, some live in witness protection. But the family members of the victims, they never get closure. So can justice be exported? So yes, my new project is on extraditions. I'm interviewing extradited people in US prisons. I'm interviewing lawyers, prosecutors, defense lawyers, judges, secretaries of foreign affairs who sign off on extradition. So it's kind of very much a continuation of this project, where it goes into what happens to justice when we're talking about organized crime that's binational, and we are only prioritizing crimes that matter to the United States.
Thank you. Thank you so much.